I've been dealing with mental health challenges since I was a child. I grew up in a kind of volatile household. I was very anxious as a child, and I felt like I was more of a burden or a problem kid. I always felt different. As I grew up, began to develop panic disorder, characterized by panic attacks, as well as OCD.
Jaylat, I really appreciate your talking to me and sharing your challenges and the journey that you've gone through. It's really great to see you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here and to share with you and everybody else the different challenges that people face when dealing with mental health.
Maybe you could talk about how you came to have these mental health challenges. When were you first aware that this was going on?
Well, I've been dealing with this mental health struggle since I was a child. I grew up in a household that wasn't very stable. There was some volatility, mental health issues with my own parents. There were addiction issues in my family, and so I was very anxious as a child as a result of that instability. I always felt different. When I think back, that's when it first started for me.
When you were going through this as a child, did anyone know you were going through this?
They were definitely aware. The adults in my life were aware, teachers were aware. But back then, now this is in the 80s, I don't think there was as much information out there about mental health. And so I felt alone in that. And I felt like I was more of a burden or a problem kid. Well, at that time, I'm so young, I don't even think I understand the concept of reaching out for help. And I think it was, imperative that the adults see the warning signs and, get help. But like I said, in my house, there was so much instability going on. I don't think they had the wherewithal to do it. And the teachers can only do so much.
You looked around at all the other kids and you thought, well, they're happy and they're doing fine and it's only me. In retrospect, when you look back on that now, maybe other children were also having problems.
What's been really great is that as I've gotten older and as mental health has become a topic that people discuss, I'm now talking to people my age who also say, yeah, I was struggling too. We were all struggling, but we just didn't have the resources.
What happened next when you grew up? How were these challenges manifested?
So as I grew up, I developed panic disorder and OCD, and those two overlap quite a bit in how their symptoms manifest. A lot of anxiety, a lot of panic attacks. It began to impact my life. I felt my world get smaller and smaller as I tried to control because I didn't want to be around other people or feel unsafe out in the world with those two things coming up in me. It made me feel, again, very other.
So your world began to shrink sounds like as you tried to control it. At what point did change occur for you?
Something inside of me didn't want to live like this anymore. I could feel the way it was impacting my quality of life, my relationships. I had goals and aspirations, and there was no way I was going to be able to reach any of those if I didn't change something. So that first little inkling of like something has to change. I did the first baby step after having that feeling.
And how old were you and what was that baby step?
I believe I was around 30 years old when I had that first kind of nudge that you have to change something.
I've heard about panic attacks, and maybe you could describe a particular one that you had and what that felt like.
So, one of the situations where I would find myself having panic attacks was while driving. The physical manifestation of it for me, like the initial start of it, would be this sudden jolt of adrenaline. I would compare it to if you've ever sat in a chair and leaned back and all of a sudden it feels like the chair is going to fall over and you're shocked. You're like,
Mhm.
you kind of have this, your breath catches. And I would feel this jolt through me. And then I would feel like my head was filling with cotton balls and I felt disassociated from the environment around me. And my heart would be racing and I would feel jittery and just like I couldn't catch my breath. And in that moment, your bodies go into this fight or flight and you just want to get somewhere safe. So when that would happen while I was driving, I felt incredibly vulnerable and you feel like you're dying in that moment is, you're convinced that something horrible is happening. It's just this horrible impending sense of doom. And when it happens in certain environments, you start to become afraid of the panic attack itself and you associate it with the environment in which it happened. And so you start to want to avoid that. So, now I'm not driving, or now I'm not going to the grocery store because I had one there. And your world, like I said, it just gets smaller and smaller.
Talk a little bit about how you discovered Innerworld and in what ways were you working on some of these issues within Innerworld?
Well, one thing that's really important is when you struggle with mental health issues, there can be relapses. You can battle your depression and get to a good place and then relapse into depression again or anxiety or whatever it is. There's a kind of a constant vigilance that you need to have with regard to your mental health. And if you do find yourself relapsing, it's really important that you recognize it, recognize the warning signs, and reach out for help again. And that's how I found Innerworld. I was struggling again with my panic and my OCD, and I
Mhm.
reached a really low point about it. And it was so incredibly helpful. I just can't stress it enough.
What made it helpful for you?
The thing that I found really helpful about Innerworld is connecting with people who were dealing with similar things and not feeling alone and being able to share your struggle with a group of people that aren't going to judge you or think you're weird and who may have some experience or knowledge they can share with you about how they've dealt with something similar. And then on top of that, because I have some knowledge about things, I can share that back and maybe help somebody else.
What sort of meetings did you go to in Innerworld to help you through some of these issues?
I remember the very first meeting that I gravitated toward was health anxiety, which makes sense with my OCD and things like that. That was incredibly helpful. I did the depression series where we worked with a lot of the tools here in Innerworld to manage your depression, to prevent relapse, and to just get yourself to a good place that you can live your life. Another one that I found incredibly helpful was the trauma group.
That's great. And of course, in Innerworld, we have tools based on cognitive, what we call cognitive behavioral immersion. Did you find the tools helpful? If so, would it be possible for you to maybe show us one of the tools to solve a challenge? I see that you've brought up the Reframe question tool, and talk a little bit about that.
I love the reframe questions because a lot of my challenges pertain to my thoughts and the feelings that they bring on and anxiety. So I'm able to go through these questions to challenge my thoughts in a way that gets me to a healthier place. And I'll give you an example that happened just recently. I was experiencing a sinus headache. And instead of going, well, you have a sinus headache, my brain wanted to go to the worst possible case scenario, some horrible, devastating illness. I was able to catch myself a lot quicker this time in my spiral downward by going to the reframe questions. Like, what is the evidence that this big scary thought that you're having is true? And what is the evidence that it's not true? And it was like, well, you have a sinus infection because you have fall allergies and you get it every fall. And so I was able to go through and challenge my automatic thoughts. And it got me to the place where I was able to get up and go to urgent care and get treatment. Yeah, and I found that in my day-to-day life, this tool, in addition to the other tools, I'll literally visualize it. It'll pop up in my head, and I'm able to work through that challenge. I can't stress enough how much of a relief it's been because it would take me down really far. I wouldn't leave my house, or like I said, my world would get small. So being able to refer back to these tools has been a lifesaver for me.
Talk about this tool, which we call the bias tool or possible distortions. How has this been helpful to you, Jaylat?
I think this tool kind of goes hand in hand with the reframe questions and challenging your thoughts. So, all or nothing thinking. I'm absolutely someone who does all or nothing thinking, overgeneralizing, discounting the positives. That's a huge issue that I have. My mind will want to go to the worst case scenario first, and I need to challenge myself when that happens and look around at the positives that I'm experiencing. And that gives me confidence. It shows me growth, and it helps
Mm.
me to kind of get rid of that all or nothing thinking.
Can you give an example of all or nothing thinking?
Sure, I'll give kind of a light example. So I used to be a runner. I used to run and do half marathons and would run every day. It gave me a lot of pleasure, helped me feel good. But over the last year, I haven't been running. And I want to get back into it, but in my brain, I'm like, well, you're certainly not going to be able to go run a half marathon, so
Mhm.
maybe just don't do anything. Well, that's not going to get me to the place that I want to be. So I remember I was in the depression meeting actually, and we were discussing this type of thinking. And I came to the conclusion during that meeting that I was going to get up after the meeting and go for a walk. And that was me challenging the all or nothing. No, I'm not going to go out and run a half marathon right now, but I can go for a walk to start.
With the help of Innerworld, you're able to rise above these experiences, that they're not going to define you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, the sense of doom and otherness that I felt for a large part of my life, you start to feel broken. But in reaching out and getting help, I realized that I'm not broken. I'm not a broken person. And things that you've experienced and things that have happened to you, they don't have to define you. It's been really helpful in Inner World to recognize that, because I can kind of go back and talk to my inner child, my little me, and just
Mm.
give her compassion and say, it wasn't your fault. Your mental health issues aren't your fault, but they are your responsibility.